Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much to the organisers as well for organising today. These are really incredibly important forums to actually develop academic thought on air power and air power strategists, but importantly that end-to-end context as well, looking from strategy right through to mission pathways as well, which I think is really vitally important, which is also where our emerging strategy in Air Force Headquarters is going. I guess a view from the top, when I first joined 36 years ago, I wouldn't have thought as a sergeant AEA I'd be giving a view to the top. Probably scare me senseless at the time when I realised that. But it does show the incredible opportunities that you can get from being part of the Air Force, starting as a sergeant cadet, working through to flight sergeant, commissioning. Done my 3 demanding Joint Operations Command jobs, one in New Zealand, one in Brussels and one in Hawaii. So I've done my Bungendore time. All right, okay, so I'd like you to, I'll start just by asking you to conjure up an image of ANZAC in your heads. Just give you a couple of seconds. All right, so what did you imagine? Perhaps the landing at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. So while the hardship and sacrifices of Gallipoli and in the trenches of the Western Front, my grandfather was there in artillery, rightly invoke an image of ANZAC, an equally vicious war was soon to transpire in the skies above. Now, with the establishment of the Australian Flying Corps in 1912, Australia's political and military leaders had shown great foresight in recognising the potential importance of air power. And this remarkably less than a decade after the Wright brothers had made their first historic manned flight. And the Flying Corps forged a culture of innovation and set the traditions that live on today in the Royal Australian Air Force. The innovative and technologically savvy Lieutenant Lawrence Wackett served on the Western Front with No. 3 Squadron, where he mastered the method of accurately dropping ammunition to ground forces by parachute. This proved to be a crucial piece of the operational jigsaw for Lieutenant General John Moynash's plans in the Battle of Amal. And the record of successes for many of the pioneering pilots of the First World War was also matched by their achievements in peace. So 2 of 1 Squadron's airmen, Paul McGuinness and Hudson Fysh, founded Qantas. Captain Ross McPherson Smith became the first to fly from England to Australia in December 1919. And Sir Charles Kingsford Smith completed the first trans-Pacific flight from the United States to Australia in 1928. And to his generation, Smithy was as much a national symbol as the famous racehorse Phar Lap or the Australian cricketer Don Bradman. So sometimes I think we actually underplay ourselves as airmen. Let me give you an example. A colleague who was a tactical coordinator on the RAF's Nimrod anti-submarine warfare aircraft was conducting his annual range shoot. An army gentleman came up to him and said, "You Raffies don't know how to handle weapons. What's the largest calibre weapon you've ever handled?" And my friend looked at him and said, "Does a nuclear depth bomb count?" So it doesn't get too much more impactful than that. And similarly, my first operational sortie on a P3 in 1985 was flying off the coast of Alaska, tasked to track a Soviet ballistic missile-firing nuclear submarine, a Yankee 1 class, with Canadian and US Navy P3s conducting 24/7 ASW. That Soviet sub, on order, was prepared to launch its arsenal of nuclear weapons to destroy a West Coast United States city. So it doesn't get too much more impactful than that, and Australian air power was there, part of the Cold War and part of the nuclear deterrence strategy. So this may sound a little provocative, and I don't wish to underplay the sacrifices here, but with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and our subsequent excursion into the Middle East over almost 2 decades has in many ways strategically dragged us off target. This while other actors have taken the opportunity to prosecute grand strategic objectives, strategic manoeuvre, as Joe would probably call it, knowing that we had one eye off the strategic ball and maybe the other eye was a little vision impaired as well. So arguably, Al-Qaeda was never an existential threat to the United States, and the reality is they were defeated a few months after September 11, 2001. But it really took the West well over a decade to realise that the exit must at some point be triggered through a strategic agreement with the Taliban. And the Bonn Agreement on December the 5th, 2001 was arguably an opportunity lost where the West entered the business of nation building in our own image and set the parameters for an extended stay. There are 2 things that the military is very good at: or arguably fairly good at, measuring and improving our preparedness for today's fight, and also ensuring we have the capabilities necessary for the future fight. There is a third piece, though, which CDF articulated to his senior leadership group at the start of this year, and that's understanding and shaping the context in which we may be called upon to fight, so subtly different from the other two. So without this important strategic context up front, we run the risk of having a force that is preparing to fight the wrong war, or one that could be potentially nullified by emerging disruptive technologies. In my mind, that's the essence of what strategy-led means. It fundamentally keeps us honest from the perspective of structural determinism. So to understand the context in which we fight, you really need to understand the geostrategic realities of the region and the Indo-Pacific. And I spent my last 2 years in Indo-Pacific Command, or Pacific Command as it was first called when I first got there, as Deputy J5. So a lot of this thought stemmed from 2 years living strategic plans and policy in Indo-Pacific Command. So recent terminology changes from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific are fundamentally in Australia's interest. We are just geostrategically positioned in the middle of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. The Indo-Pacific is a vast region, and it would be difficult for a power like Australia to protect and advance its interests in a region this vast. PACOM's AOR, for example, was 52% of the Earth's surface, 377,000 force-assigned troops, 3/4 of the US Navy. But it's still not enough without allies and partners. The region is an area of increased competition among powers great and powers growing. If strategy is a quest to connect the ends, the ways and the means, which we often think about it, i.e. what you want to do with what you have to do it, in an area as large as the Indo-Pacific, the ends can be infinite, but means never. An Indo-Pacific strategy requires Australia to align our limited means with our extensive interests across a large region that has become or becoming the global centre of gravity. So why not just step back? If we reduce our ambitions and shrink our mental map of the region so that ends and means align, then we don't get in anyone's way. The trouble is that the region is interconnected and no nation is an island. This applies to defence and security, trade, investment, aid and development, and the interplay of power and wealth in so-called geoeconomics. Also applies to these systems of rules, power and diplomacy that connect all these elements together. So, what's the role of air power in this geostrategic and geopolitical realm? Well, I'm going to let you consider that question yourselves, but I would help you by pointing out that over the past decade, while the US and its allies, including Australia, were acquiring the most advanced military capabilities in the world, including advanced aerospace capabilities, others were arguably winning without fighting, strategic manoeuvre, extracting warlike gains in territorial and positional advantage below the threshold of armed conflict. So I think the first so what to that is that the traditional NATO phasing model is a linear approach and may no longer be fit for purpose to deal with political warfare and actions in the so-called grey zone. If we are waiting for a traditional declaration of war before we are prepared to employ our exquisite platforms against those that seek to compete with us, then we will always be shooting behind the duck. So how do we start strategically leading the duck? So from an air power viewpoint, we have incredibly capable exquisite platforms like the JSF, but our mindset has been locked into how these platforms force generate to fight and win in an advanced warfight. And I have no doubt they would fight and win. Our platforms and our people are awesome. But I would pose the question to you that we also need to be able to understand how these exquisite and advanced fifth-generation air power capabilities can function and contribute to whole-of-government outcomes in environments short of kinetic armed conflict. This requires us to think less about advanced warfighting and more about influence and deterrence. And when I was in PACOM, it was all about a deterrent narrative. But if deterrent fails, then you need an interplay and connected series of advanced capabilities that can fight and win. And you do that through allies and partners, of course, as well. We must be able to orchestrate air power effects within a whole-of-government framework to provide opportunities for statecraft. Our capabilities must be able to expose malign activity, providing our diplomats with the leverage they require to influence the calculus of other political actors while exposing them to broader regional and international pressures. Now, I guess my version of success, if I was to try and visualise this, would be one of our exquisite platforms exposing malign activity through its array of very advanced capabilities in a country X. Then the Australian Foreign Minister, with no air gap between that, would have access to that information. So it means completely joined up in an intergovernment, whole-of-government sense, and would be able to go to the Foreign Minister of country X and say, we just saw country Z doing this in your economic exclusion zone. How shall we respond to this? But that requires a completely connected whole-of-government framework with no daylight between it. So it's a highly creative pursuit and requires airmen with innovative and leading-edge thought who understand how to employ air power beyond just delivering a kinetic effect at the extreme right-hand edge of the conflict spectrum. It's about information, it's about influence and strategic calculus. In an air power sense, this is also about subordinating the platform. Platforms are just effectors. And that will require some cultural change in terms of re-imaging the qualities, attributes and the skills of our people that we value. We need to develop air power strategists who can envision strategy to mission pathways end to end. While we're on the subject of platforms, Joe had a great slide up there before of a production line in the industrial age during World War II, probably about 50 or 60 bombers being rolled off that production line. In 1944, the US alone produced some 38,000 fighter aircraft. That's over 100 fighter aircraft per day off the production line to deal with attrition. This level of production will never happen for today's exquisite platforms. So we essentially fight with what we have. So perhaps we might also want to think about cheaper mass-produced disruptive air power effects that can operate in concert with our exquisite capabilities. I've gone on probably long enough, but I'd summarise this by saying that it's about deterrence, it's about influence, it's about altering strategic calculus, it's about air power effects right through the conflict spectrum and allowing statecraft to be able to have influence, the military line of effort supporting other parallel lines of effort. This will need to include information operations, deception, psyops, electronic warfare and attacks, cyber and space and advanced kinetic effects. The confluence of electronic warfare and cyber will become important. In doing so, we must be able to demonstrate to malign actors through synchronised air power effects that their ability to manoeuvre through all domains and at all ends of the conflict spectrum will be challenged and potentially exposed. So pivoting back to where I started from, we're facing a similar challenge to our forebears in the Australian Flying Corps in World War I. They had incredible vision and insight to rapidly evolve the utility of air power on the battlefield. The challenges that we face today are not dissimilar. We must provide the necessary vision and insight to evolve how air power contributes more broadly to connecting ends, ways and means across a region that has become or is becoming the global centre of gravity. We need to be able to look at this end-to-end from strategy to mission pathways to achieve whole-of-government effects. Thank you very much.